everyone. From Georgia State University's Center for International Business Education and Research, CIBER, in Atlanta, Georgia, I'm Lian Liu. We come to you on behalf of the MSI CIBER Consortium that are sponsoring and organizing this webinar series. We thank each and every one of you for joining us from all over the world. We're very grateful you choose to spend the hour with us. This webinar marks the 60th webinar since we started in April 2020 with more than 10,000 participants. Just a reminder, these webinars are being recorded. If you want to watch again or forward to others, you can find the recordings of this one and previous sessions on our GSU-CIBER website or our YouTube channel. Today's webinar is on the very frontier topic in international business, the economic and business environment in Africa. Our speakers are Professor Mourad Dakhli of Georgia State University and Professor Carolyn Chisadza of University of Pretoria, South Africa. Mourad is a master teacher professor at Georgia State, who himself will be receiving our faculty recognition award this afternoon. But he's joining us from Tunisia. And Mourad will introduce Carolyn. So Mourad, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you for CIBER for this opportunity again to share some of our research, some of our knowledge, and some of our passion with our speakers. And I'm glad to see actually some familiar faces actually in the chat here and as participants. If you have questions, please, that comes up, you can type it in the Q&A. That's probably easier so that we know that those are where the questions are. Any comments also you can put in the chat. I am delighted to see an old friend. She's not old, but we met a few years ago, pre-pandemic, on a study abroad in South Africa, Carolyn Chisadza. And I said I'm delighted to have you join me in having another conversation about Africa. And these are ongoing conversations that we hope will constitute a series on a regular basis, maybe twice a year, where we update our audiences about what is happening on the continent. So it is actually appropriate that we are joining you today. Karen is in the southern tip of Africa, in South Africa, and I am currently in North Africa, in Tunisia, and we are actively engaged in different types of projects. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Carolyn to introduce herself.
Great, thanks, Mourad. And thank you so much for inviting me to this webinar. I look forward to our conversation. Just interesting, I want to find out, Mourad, because it is raining cats and dogs at the southern tip of Africa. Is it raining in North Africa?
It was raining, but now it's beautiful.
So you can see, right? Africa is interesting. We've got such vast climate temperature as well. So it's actually evening in where I'm located in South Africa. It's 6 p.m. I understand in Atlanta, I think it's about 11. So good evening from my side. Good morning to you guys. I'm a senior lecturer in the economics department at the University of Pretoria, which is based in South Africa. My research interests are predominantly in economic growth and development, but with a particular focus on institutions and conflict related to African development. My lecture, first year microeconomics, and third year module in Introduction to Economic Growth, where I discuss growth models by Solo and Roma and other growth economists, and their applications to explaining the differences in development between and within countries across the world. And then I also have a master's module in economic development, where I discuss and debate with my students on some of the historical events that occurred in Africa, which may explain the current development levels on the continent. So that's just me briefly. And I look forward to today's afternoon webinar.
Very well. So just to briefly, working on Africa has always been a priority for Georgia State, because of who we are, because of our heritage, and because of what we are about. So we have a keen interest in Africa. And just to highlight some of the activities that I know, Carolyn, you probably are familiar with some of these, our study abroad in South Africa, but we do also have other study abroad programs. We take our students to different locations, Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Egypt. We have quite a few projects in Egypt, and Morocco, and I'm working on one in Tunisia. So we do have covered the continent reasonably well as far as student exchange, academic exchange. But we also have, I'm delighted to report that we received the grant, the BIA grant, and the grant, Professor Lian Lu and myself secured that grant for the next 2 years, and that is to increase our focus on Africa, and it's focused on capacity development, developing students' capacity to effectively work across cultures within the context of Africa. So the exchange with the different various regions in Africa. Of course, when we say Africa, we're talking about different regions. There is so much diversity, as you said, Carolyn, a second ago, and we should not make the assumption that it's a one country, as some of my students would say sometimes. So I want to make sure I make this corrections. But lately, we also invested in virtual exchange relationships. So of course, with the pandemic, it's hard to travel, it's hard to take students. So now this is a nice growing template of collaboration where we actually have students working together on live cases, working together on case writing, working together on consulting projects, and what have you. And we've done that in South Africa, we've done that in Morocco, we've done that in Tunisia, and we're expanding that in different regions. So we are very active in Africa, and we are becoming more and more active. So I would like to put you on the spot, Carolyn, and maybe start with providing us with a context of doing business in Africa. And now our audience are interested in the economic and business environment, as we promised. So maybe we'll start with the larger context, if you could address that, and then I'll follow up with some of the maybe consequences of that context on doing business on the continent.
Yeah. So I briefly want to just give historical context of Africa so that our listeners or our audience can understand when we do start discussing about the business opportunities, why sometimes there may be challenges in business investments in Africa, but that does not mean that business opportunities are not available. They definitely are, because Africa is a young continent and it's developing and it is dynamic. So I'll just share my screen for some visual aid, also just to help our listeners to see where Africa is. I always test my students at the beginning of the year, and I ask them to pick countries in the world, and I put locations, and you'll be amazed that geography is clearly not a strong point in a lot of people.
We have a lot to share there.
Yeah. So Africa is a continent, right? So Africa is this continent here, south of Europe, between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. The continent is 11.7 million square miles. In square kilometers, that's 30.3 million square kilometers, including islands, and it covers 6% of the Earth's total surface. So just to give you better context, you can fit in China, India, United States, Japan, and most of Europe and United Kingdom combined in Africa. So that's how large the continent is. And it's also endowed with the most natural resources in the world. And of course, it is an absolutely amazing and beautiful continent when it comes to nature, wildlife, culture, and food. I mean, we host the big five, right? The lion, the leopard, the black rhino, the elephant, and the African buffalo, which I'm sure some of you have only probably seen behind bars in a zoo. Well, I get to see them in their natural habitat. So you guys, if you can beat that, I don't know. So I would really suggest that you make Africa one of the places you visit in your life, right? It is worth the experience. So the continent is split into 5 regions. We've got North Africa, West Africa, East, Central, and South. And it's made up of 54 sovereign states. So that'll be the map to your left. Africa is the second largest and the second most populous continent in the world after Asia. It accounts for 16% of the world population. And obviously, Africa has the richest concentration of natural resources, right? Oil, copper, diamonds, and forests as well. It is estimated that about 30% of the Earth's mineral resources can be found in the African continent. But despite the wealth of the natural resources, Africa still lags behind in development due to the resource curse effect, which sometimes take place in some of the countries where you get corruption and resource mismanagement coming in. Interestingly, though, the shape of the continent, so you can see the continent is taller than wider if you compare it to Europe and North America. So what this means is that Africa has a fractured landscape because the continent passes through many climates. As I was saying with Mourad, that it's raining here, it's not raining in North Africa. So Africa is the only continent in the world to be situated in all of our 4 hemispheres. It is the only continent to stretch from the northern temperate to the southern temperate zones. So we've got a variety of climates and temperatures taking place in Africa. Africa also has many different cultures and many tribes, which makes it a very diverse continent. But on the downside, because we are so fractionalized, this left us vulnerable to divisions during the slave trade and colonization. So 2 historical events that happened in Africa and where you still see the persistence of these historical events playing out in the progress and development of Africa is the slave trade and the colonial and the colonization period. So Africa was the only continent that was subjected to severe slave trade, with West Africa suffering the worst raiding. Between the 1400s and 1800s, slave exports were most prominent along your coastal countries and those nearer to the coast. Millions of people were forced to flee from their homes because of slave trade. There was forced migration, which left economies with collapsed institutions and societies fragmented, right? So we now have this ethnic, these tribal divisions, because during the slave trade, you were trying to protect your tribe, so you would offer to sell labor from the other tribe. And this unfortunately caused a lot of friction, which still plays out today, even though slave was abolished. We've got our independence, but you still find that some tribes have this conflict that's taking place, and this factors into the development, in delaying the development of Africa. I mean, there's interesting literature from Nathan Nunn where he talks about the adverse effects of Africa's slave trade on political and social structures of societies. And then the other historical event that I just want to quickly discuss is colonization. I mean, everybody knows about this, right? When the Europeans migrated from their homelands to find lands with resources, and some even settling in the lands. This period has been debated in economic history, right? Especially because some people think that it was good. Colonization came with development to Africa, and others feel that colonization was the demise of Africa's development. So as I said earlier, Africa has many ethnic tribes. So if you look at the figure 1A, that shows you how the continent was divided along ethnic tribe borders pre-colonization. So those were the borders before the Europeans put in the national borders, right? But between the end of the slave trade and the beginning of colonization, another major event took place that may explain current African development. So this was the partitioning of Africa into colonies. And that shows figure 1B. The white lines then show you how Africa was partitioned by the colonizers. And in doing that, what they actually did was they divided. You can see that some of those lines are actually dividing ethnic tribes. And so what you find now is that you've got an ethnic tribe that may live in Zimbabwe, and then their relatives live across the border in Mozambique. And now what's more important? Is it your ethnic identity or your national identity? So this has caused quite a bit of friction as well. And there's been quite some empirical evidence conducted where they say the partitioning of Africa caused ethnic conflicts as tribes started to fight. And what's surprising is that these borders were determined and agreed upon in European states at a time when Europeans had barely settled in Africa and they had limited knowledge of local conditions in Africa. And yet, despite the randomness of the division of Africa, these boundaries have persisted, right? So these are the countries that you see today. And you can see that the map of Africa to the further right, those are the common languages that are there now, based upon the colonizers that took over certain regions in Africa. And then you've got other studies as well that sort of discuss the positive effects of colonization, right? So they say that where the Europeans could settle, what they did was that they then imported their legal institutions, their education, and the quality of life. And this is what has persisted today, which is why we've got high human capital and political institutions in place. So I mean, it's fascinating, which is why focusing on African literature and focusing on African context is so interesting, because there are all these things these issues that are still being debated and there's still no consensus. I mean, whenever I start this conversation in my class, there's immediately a division of some people saying, yes, colonization was good, and others saying, no, colonization was bad. We could have done it by ourselves. We didn't need help from the Europeans. So it's quite fascinating. So yeah. So before I discuss any of these political trends in Africa, Mourad, I'm sure you will concur with me that despite these setbacks, Africa still has the greatest potential than any other continent. I mean, according to a recent article by Forbes, it is considered one of the fastest growing continents, and it has what is soon to be the world's largest workforce, and as an opportunity to transform into a global economic powerhouse.
Absolutely, absolutely. As a matter of fact, some of those points I will pick up on and explain how they relate to specific business opportunities in the continent.
Yeah. So I just want to lay the macro economic, so the trends, the economic and political trends in Africa, and also just to give some context to Africa's challenges and progress in creating an environment that's conducive for business investments, which is what Mourad would then come in as well to discuss. So although, as I said, Africa is blessed with abundance of natural resources, but we still remain the least wealthy continent in terms of GDP per capita compared to the rest of the world. And several reasons for the continent's delay. I've already discussed our historical events, right? But also Africa has got the largest number of conflict episodes. We've got delayed democratic transitions. I mean, most countries in Africa only gained their independence from colonizers starting from the 1950s. So we're only like 50 or 60 years in the making, compared to Europe, where they've been in the making for over 100 years already. So you can imagine that we are still transitioning and we're still working out the nicks and the cracks in our economies, right? So we also struggle with illiteracy rates, low skills development, and lack of capacity to cater for a growing population. These negatives, however, did not stop Africa from experiencing growth in the last 2 decades, driven largely by China's increased demand for natural resources, as well as favorable prices received for primary commodities. I mean, overall, the continent has achieved an average annual growth rate of 4% between 1960 and 2019. And despite the slowdown in economic growth after the financial crisis, I mean, you can see that even with the world around 2008, 2009, everyone suffered from that global financial crisis. Our growth performance still remains quite resilient and above the average levels that, you know, we started at in the 70s. The challenge though right now is the lack. So even though we've got this high growth rate, there's a lack of growth spillover benefits being reflected in our income per capita, in the wealth of the people of the African continent. And this is an indication that shows some of the deficiency in the structure of the growth and the lack of policy measures to ensure that the wider population also benefits from a fast growing population. So we are still trying, so I say we are still trying to get the inclusive growth strategy to work in our favor. And obviously COVID-19 really did not help us, right? So that's also, we are going to see Africa regressing in terms of growth, in terms of progress in development because of the COVID-19 pandemic as well. One of our other challenges is a growing population, but not enough resources to cater for it. And Africa's fast growing population is mainly driven by our fertility rates, right? So we still have one of the highest fertility rates if you compare with other global regions. But even at 5.8, which is what we are averaging right now, it's still not as high as, you know, 10 or 20 years ago. So our fertility rates have been declining slowly over the years. And obviously the implications of the slowing down in fertility rates is that Africa is starting to experience the so-called demographic transition, a trend which was already already established in other global regions, right? So we are starting to experience, as more women, I guess, as more women have more opportunities to enter the labor market, as more women get educated, this is also now delaying women, the time that when women have children, right? So this slows down the fertility rates as well. So hopefully, some of these factors can continue. I mean, the biggest question, obviously, is how can we speed up this reduction in the fertility rate? A key priority in Africa's development agenda, which is similar to any other global agenda, is education. We all know that human capital accumulation feeds back into economic growth. And what Africa really got right was basic primary education for all. Africa's current primary school enrollment rate is about 80% on average. Yet despite these successes in our primary school enrollment rates, we still have these inequalities and inefficiencies in this key critical sector of skills development. So even with significant increase in the number of children with access to basic education, what we are observing is that a large number of children still remain out of school. And another challenge that's facing policymakers right now is the low secondary and tertiary enrollment rates. And these lag significantly behind the primary enrollment rates. According to a recent United Nations Development Program report, only 4 out of 100 children in Africa are expected to enter a graduate and postgraduate institution, compared to 36 out of 100 in Latin America and 14 out of 100 in South and West Asia. So, and additionally, our infrastructure is also quite delayed. So even though we've got, and we might have an increase in the number of children, but then the school buildings, we don't have enough school buildings to cater for the increasing number of children. And then this also factors into why you then get low enrollment rates. And school materials as well is something that we need to look into. Our life expectancy lags behind by about 10 years with the rest of the world, which is not so bad. It used to be worse. It's definitely increased now. The Human Development Index for Africa has has significantly increased over the years, and improvements in medicines and technologies have been contributing to a better quality of life for Africa. So hopefully this will continue as well. So again, this means that Africa has got a healthy labor force, and with a growing population, it means that there's a lot of scope for investment because the labor is there in Africa as well. In terms of unemployment rate, I mean, this is important. Africa is starting to edge past Europe's high unemployment rates. So according to the latest International Labour Organization estimates, the global unemployment rate was at 5.42 in 20%, but Africa is currently averaging 6.8%, followed by Europe and Central Asia. However, what's interesting though is that Africa is surprisingly the lowest youth unemployment rate, which is quite surprising. I thought we would have the highest youth unemployment rate because we've got such a, Africa's population is predominantly young, right? So we've got a youth bulge. But clearly, the statistics from international labor organizations, they state otherwise, right? They say that we have the lowest youth unemployment rate if we compare to Europe and Central Asia, America, and the Pacific region. But what those statistics actually don't tell us is that it does not reflect the actual reality of unemployment confronting the youth or the realities of the labor market in Africa, right? So that could be a challenge that could be a challenge for development progress in Africa. Well, yeah, infrastructure has always been a challenge for us. But again, I stick behind the fact that we are a growing continent. So we are getting there. Give us time, right? Give us time. So poor infrastructure is one of the key impediments to investment and growth in Africa. For example, nearly 600 million Africans lack access to the electricity grid. But while Africa's infrastructure still lags behind that of other developing regions, we have made significant progress, right? So Africa's annual investment in infrastructure has doubled to around $80 billion a year since the beginning of the century. So structural change is taking place in Africa. And here I just used mobile connectivity as a proxy for infrastructure development, because that's where the future is headed, right? We are all going online. And you can see that Africa features predominantly in the emerging and discoveries economy. So we are the blue, we've got a lot of the blue and the yellow in our country. So many countries on the continent, they are beginning to adopt these technologies and to improve their infrastructure to increase productivity and to provide more efficient ways for consumers, workers, and businesses to trade, communicate, and to access information. So these changes also reflect the impact of technological progress, which is a changing global marketplace. And it's also changing the way Africa uses its natural resource endowments for industrialization prospects. And this actually represents a really big opportunities for investors and entrepreneurs with ideas to help solve Africa's infrastructure challenges. So there's really scope here for innovation and to help Africa to deal with the quality of their infrastructure.
Carolyn, that's actually an excellent point, and I will pick up on that. That is, again, can be seen as, of course, as a limitation, but also an opportunity, as we can see in just a couple of minutes.
Yeah. And then just two final trends that I think are important for context regarding opportunities and investments in Africa. So foreign aid, right? This should come as no surprise that African countries have been recipients of foreign assistance since their independence. And there are two sides to the debate on the foreign aid, right? The challenge with foreign aid that has been highlighted is that Africa's aid-dependent model provides, free money, which really doesn't help the country in taking advantage of opportunities provided by the global economy. So we're just dependent on people helping us instead of trying to find solutions to help ourselves. Also, foreign aid is not a problem by itself, but misallocation of resources, corruption, and bad governance limit Africa's ability to use the aid. So when we do get the foreign aid, we are not seeing the benefits of the foreign aid translating into inclusive growth. And this is a big issue in Africa. And obviously, the quality of institutions play a really big role in ensuring that policies to improve the quality of life are executed to allow people the freedom to make their own choices. So poor institutions can be very detrimental to the functioning of an economic system. In Africa, progress on good governance has been encouraging, but challenges still remain, as you can see from the Corruption Perception Index. I mean, most of Africa is red, right? This is really, really a big issue in Africa, which then factors into attracting business opportunities from investors from outside, and also just delaying Africa's development progress, right? So we've got several African countries that have undertaken institutional reforms and have changed their governance structures, but we're still a long way to go. Quite a number of countries have not yet achieved the type of reforms that can prevent dictatorship, corruption, and economic decline. Sectarian violence, weak and ineffective leadership, lack of political will, you find these in countries like Eritrea, Zimbabwe, recently South Sudan. So we are still burdened by poor functioning governance infrastructure. But even though, we have these issues, and maybe Africa is turbulent because it is young and dynamic, but it is turbulent because it is also growing and dynamic. So development is disruptive, right? It's like growing up, growing pains. So development is disruptive, but it also presents huge opportunities, as Mourad will agree with me now, right? So Africa really, really presents an amazing location and an amazing environment for business investments to come in. We just need to take care of our infrastructure and our governance as well. Yeah, Mourad?
All right, thank you. And very, very informative. I know there were a couple of questions, and some in the audience maybe are interested in the year of the slide or the source of the slide. So one thing we can do is maybe add those before we share the slide decks with everyone. There's a keen interest in those. It is quite interesting. You talked about the area, and I'm not sure if that was kind of easy to visualize, but I'm trying to see here if I can maybe share a visual that's quite telling, kind of building on something you just mentioned. And let's see if I can share my. Am I able to share here? Yes. And it's quite misleading actually when you talk about Africa, because this is what are you able to see my?
Yes.
Okay. This is actually the real area of Africa. So this is what Africa should be drawn like, but in the most common maps, obviously, that we are familiar with, it looks much, much smaller. So I'm sure that when you said, Carolyn, that the US and China and India and all can fit in Africa, everyone is wondering, how can that be possible?
Yeah.
But it is possible just because this is really what Africa looks like true to area. And I show my students this graph, follow to your discussion. This is how the US would fit. This is how China would fit. This is how India would fit. And most of Western Europe, taking the other places. So it is a massive continent, and sometimes the traditional way of drawing the continent are not very, very representative of the reality. All right, I hope you are able to see my White Africa slide here.
Yes, we
Okay,
can
very
see it,
good.
Mourad.
So Carolyn, actually, I'm going to pick up on quite a few items that you shared, and I saw some very interesting questions that actually, well, at least one, if not two, I had myself questions, especially about why is it that when it comes to Africa, North Africa is chopped off. I am in North Africa right now, and you are in South Africa, but I know I had to struggle to pull data from different countries to come up with my Africa-wide numbers, doing it group by group, because I could not find, especially in the World Bank, where North Africa is lumped with the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa. Even when companies do business, quite often you have the MENA manager and you have Sub-Saharan Africa manager. So that is a challenge for many of us who do business in Africa. And there are quite a few questions there in the Q&A, and I'll promise we'll get to those. I want to make sure that I have a clock somewhere. So remind me, I don't see anything here, to allow some time for Q&A, maybe 15 minutes or so. But these pick up on what Carolyn was talking about. 50% are under 20. It's a very young continent, the youngest continent out there. And it's an urban setting. It's urbanizing fast, one of the fastest rates of urbanization. And I'll show you a kind of telling slide in there. So in terms of the population, every 35% live within 25 kilometers of connectivity. Cities are becoming really the drivers of economic development and business opportunities in Africa. I was talking to a colleague of mine who runs two companies, does a lot of business in Africa, and he said that is really changing the way he's doing business as he realizes where opportunities are. Urbanization that my colleague talked about is changing his strategy and what he does on the continent. So these are some of the key trends as far as opportunities. Now we talked about the population, 2.5 billion by 2050. But from a business opportunity perspective, one of the key indicators is middle class. And I saw the numbers people are interested in. Maybe the best thing to do is add, in this case, actually have the link down there below, so you can see where the data came from. But disposable income. Disposable income is one of the most important indicators of market opportunities in emerging markets. Middle class is growing. Currently, the middle class in Africa is small per percentage, but because of the growth in the population, because of the growth in the rate at which people from the lower income categories are moving up to middle class, we're seeing 300 million right now, but that's expected to double, I believe. Maybe something got chopped off there by the 2030, which is where the data is actually come from. So consumer expenditure is growing, and it's growing at a compounded rate. People are spending money. So it is true that per capita income is low, but many companies that have many good cases. Maybe some of you are familiar with them. Nestle is one of the companies that come to mind who actually have changed their strategy, targeting lower income consumers, and they have done very well. So lower income does not mean lack of market. It just means the strategy or the way you price things, the way you bundle things, the way you the type of product and service has to fit, of course, the consumer. One important item, and I saw a question there about informal and formal. Actually, there is a move now, a fast move from the informal markets to more institutionalized formal markets, including things like e-commerce, where it's much easier to track, obviously, expenditures. And it comes from something that Carolyn, you were talking about. Yes, there is some weakness in the institution and efficacy of the institutions, but as these develop, more and more of the informal transaction are kind of come into the formal system, and that has, of course, important implications, especially for supply chain and logistics and firms in that space. The largest markets on the continent, of course, we focus on some of the biggest economies: Nigeria, Egypt, and South Africa. These are your biggest three, right? These are the biggest markets, and you have followed by Ethiopia and Morocco. Algeria is there. Unfortunately, Algeria, despite its size, has been quite a planned economy and a resource oil and gas-based economy. But hopefully, if it starts moving toward the free market, I think we'll hear more about Algeria. Ethiopia has been actually one of the fastest growing consumer markets in terms of growth rate. Key sectors for opportunities, and I will look at specific countries separately. Energy, of course. Carolyn, you talked about the infrastructure. Energy is a key factor. I mean, I was in South Africa, and we came close to rollouts. You know, energy was shutting down and blackouts, you know, they're going on rollouts because Eskom, the largest energy producer, is falling short in as far as production is concerned. You cannot sustain economic growth without reliable, sustained energy production. This is a major issue in Africa, despite what Carol, you mentioned. Africa is a resource-rich country, and it's very rich in oil and gas, coal, and other energy sources. Infrastructure, again, that is a key challenge, but it is also a key opportunity. So we have seen a lot of investment in infrastructure. A lot of it is driven by China's engagement, and I will talk about China. My goal is to address this side of the kind of the consumer market, the investment side of things, but also I have to have time to talk about China and China's engagement as a major trend happening in Africa, and maybe the Continental Free Trade Agreement and its implication on Africa. Healthcare, again, is a major growth opportunity on the continent. And the last time I was looking at business opportunity, the Department of Commerce, International Trade Administration publishes this doing business series in different markets, and they identify the hottest sectors. Where are the opportunities? If you are a business person and you are trying to invest in the continent, in different countries, where are the opportunities? And it seems like healthcare is one of those areas that cuts across different areas, different regions, different cities in the continent. ICT, information technology and communication technology, is also a major area. And there is a leapfrogging effect taking place in Africa. Landlines are very hard to come by. I know in my home country, we were on the waiting list for 7 years before we were able to get a landline, a phone landline a long time ago. It's still difficult today. You can get a cell phone. Who cares today about landlines? You know, you can have a cell phone. So there's this leapfrogging effect because of the technological innovation that's taking place. These are some of the consumer expenditure in major retail sectors. So furniture is there, electronics is there. Household cleaners is quite interesting. It's actually one of the fastest growing, fast moving consumer goods in Africa. I took my students to Morocco, and we were fortunate enough to work with Procter & Gamble, and we did the consulting project for the company in Casablanca. And that discussion was driven by the company's ambitious plans on the continent. So Procter & Gamble really has a 5-year plan to become the leader. They have a leadership position already, but really increase their presence on the continent there for household cleaners and other fast-moving consumer goods. Clothing and footwear is also there. And of course, food, beverage, and tobacco. Tobacco is a major, unfortunately, is a major import product in many countries in Africa. And this, you have the figure for total retail, and I believe this actually from 2016, so this few years back. We are very hesitant to use data from 2020. You see, we have data for 2020 and even 2021 up to today. It's distorted. The pandemic has really messed things up, and quite often, I think for any trend analysis, stopping at 2018 actually provides a better picture of what's happening in Africa. More on consumer demand. So as a share of Africa's total economy, consumer spending is now fast growing. It's becoming a bigger chunk of the GDP. So just like many other economies, China is one of them, consumer spending is growing and it's becoming a big part of economic activity. Interestingly, e-commerce is growing fast, and many companies from China are really doing well in Africa. E-commerce, Alibaba and a couple others. The consumer in Africa is becoming more sophisticated. So the idea that because the per capita income is low, so I can put in a low quality product does not hold. And you can talk to business persons who are in Africa. We talk to Procter & Gamble, we talk to Unilever, we talk to so many companies on our study abroad programs, and they will tell you, you know, this is sophisticated consumer. They know what they want, and they want value, right? And that is something that has to be kept in mind.
Yeah, and Mourad, if I can just interject
Please,
there,
yes.
when you speak about e-commerce, that is actually a really, really big opportunity in Africa, because the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, really brought to the surface the inefficiency of our infrastructure in terms of online shopping, online schooling. A lot of universities were forced to go online, and all of a sudden policymakers just realized that they were really not prepared for e-commerce. So this is an amazing opportunity in Africa, because we need to increase our access, our internet access, to reach even the poor people as well.
Yes, and that is actually, Carolyn, part of the leapfrogging effect. I was in a meeting just yesterday with one of the universities here, and they are working with a company. The company is it's a startup, it's in e-commerce. They've been working with the company for many years. Then the pandemic happened, and guess what? It was a blessing. Yeah. It sped up the ability of the company to offer things online. So the necessity is the mother of all inventions, right? So and you see that today. All right, so I'm going to skip this one here, but again, back to the key markets, if you want to prioritize areas, Nigeria, Egypt, and South Africa. I mean, collectively, these three account for over 50% of the business opportunities on the continent, right? And then you do have, as I mentioned, opportunities in Ethiopia, in Morocco, but still the three big players, as you can see here, and that's somewhat expected to continue, maybe decline a little bit as other economies emerge. Again, Ethiopia, Ghana is one of them, Kenya and Morocco. But still, I think this is still going to continue for a while. One of the items I think, Carolyn, you mentioned is cities. Cities are the driver of economic growth and prosperity on the continent. We just developed a study abroad program focused on cities. We're looking at some of the emerging market cities, especially in Africa. And I mentioned the case of the company. It's a healthcare company, it's a technology company. And the gentleman said that now my strategy is focused on cities. I can do very well just selecting three major cities: Lagos, Casablanca, in this case, Cairo, and I think Johannesburg is one that he's targeting also. Just those 3 or 4 cities constitute the bulk of his future market in the continent. So the conversation here is dramatically changing from the continent to countries to cities, and this is actually happening in many other areas, but specifically in Africa because of the urbanization. We are looking at urban population growth. This is from Global Edge. This is, I think, 2020 data, and it's still significant, and people are moving from the countryside to the cities in everywhere around the continent. All right. So I provided kind of highlights of the key aspects of the consumer market and some of the factors driving that: middle class, consumption capacity, of course, in this case, and urbanization. But there are also challenges. Of course, natural resources dependency is always a challenge. So your markets go in Nigeria, in Algeria. These are two economies that are highly dependent on oil and gas, and of course, the well-being is always dependent on the price of oil. So that is something that companies need to keep in mind for planning. Distribution channels. Now, we talked about this weak infrastructure, especially in rural areas. In the cities, congestion. Actually, the study I referenced here, which is from Brookings, estimated the cost of city congestions on the cost of doing business. So yes, it's much more concentrated market. Maybe you don't have to invest heavily in reaching suburban areas. A lot of the markets can be within cities, but congestion does have its cost too. Informal markets still dominate in Africa. There's still a big chunk in certain economy is estimated at half or sometimes over half of all business transactions are unaccounted for transactions. So that's something that's there. That has actually pluses and minuses. So one could think of that in multiple ways. This is from the US perspective, competition is heating up. So they go into Africa, yes, the opportunities are there, but just to go with the assumption that Africa is not competitive because it's starting is wrong. China is there, Russia is there, Turkey now is there, India is there, Middle Eastern countries, I know Dubai, Qatar are also actively investing in Africa and doing business in Africa. Carolyn, you mentioned this, market access, bureaucracy, institutions. It is still there, and they even in the area of consumer goods and regular consumption, you still run into those type of barriers, especially for exporters. There are sometimes administrative barriers to limit imports from other countries and direct whatever foreign currency toward more necessity items. All right, this is foreign direct investment. We can skip this one. I think Karen, you mentioned this, but this is again where most of the investment is going. So as far as major opportunities, I think this is more specific than the big picture. In Nigeria, automotive is a great opportunity. People are buying cars. Construction, of course, the growth. Nigeria is growing. Same way with Egypt. I mean, construction and infrastructure are also big. One thing that actually I enjoyed looking at when I was looking at this is education and training, and how if you look at Nigeria, you look at Egypt, you look at South Africa, and I think you look at Ethiopia. Education and training is a growth opportunity for people like us. This is an opportunity, obviously, and this is why I am here in Tunisia. We are building bridges. We are using multiple ways to sign agreements with universities here. We've done that in South Africa. We've done that in Morocco. So I think the human capital element that Carolyn, you talked about is actually a big investment opportunity for universities and other training centers. Healthcare also is a major one. I mentioned that, and infrastructure. So you could see how some of the things that we were mentioned before as some of the challenges, the infrastructure aspect, of course, the lead in the energy aspect, lead into opportunities, of course, for some of these major economies. All right. One thing I like to mention, and there's some, this is a business case we are working on right now, is a growing phenomenon of Africans investing in Africa. So now it is not just about providing opportunities for outside, but there are also opportunities for African companies. We were in South Africa and we talked to South African companies that are expanding in Nigeria, expanding in Kenya, of course in SADC region, the economic trade area, neighboring South Africa. Morocco has done a very good job. Egypt, maybe has been a first mover, but on our visits to companies in Morocco, quite few of them are going to French-speaking Africa, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, where Moroccan companies, Moroccan banks are opening branches. We visited a mattress company that has a manufacturing plant in Cote d'Ivoire, and this is a growing phenomenon as more companies become more competitive. They're looking at Africa, and you see more and more of that, I think, amazing phenomena. And this is actually a case in the development right now, looking at the phenomena of these African companies. And by the way, displacing the colonial players. So the French are not happy about it. The British are not happy about it. And a friend of mine shared with me that there was a complaint by the French because of some of the practices of the Moroccan companies in Ivory Coast and in Senegal. So that's quite an interesting phenomenon that's taking place.
Yeah,
all
and
right.
just to
Yes,
add
please,
to
go
that,
ahead, yes.
Mourad, for South Africa, they're actually also trying to increase the footprint of their state-owned companies because they're within Africa, because they realize that there's so much opportunity for the state-owned entities to enter into the rest of Africa and also provide services. So that was quite an interesting report that I was asked to do from one of the public sector organizations to see where the scope was and whether there was room for state-owned companies to invest in other African countries. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, very interesting. And I'm going to skip the part about China. I'm happy to share this, but China has been, of course, a game changer in Africa and game changer in terms of doing business. A very tough competitor. And if you don't believe it, why Africa is interested, these are pictures of all the leaders who are visiting Africa, this past couple of years and now, and I know that's Zuma there, so that's a couple of years there, but you got China, you got Germany, you got Russia, you got Turkey, you got the French, you got the British, everyone is going to Africa, and everyone realizes how important Africa is there. I think I'm going to skip that part there. I want to address some questions. There were some really a couple interesting questions that I would love to talk about, but I will share the entire slide deck. One of the questions I saw that I thought is interesting is, why is it that North Africa is separated from the rest of Africa? And I have my conspiracy theory about it. Is really an attempt to separate the continent, And I think because of linguistics, what have you, lump in a region that's an integral part of the continent. And for example, when I was looking at data, and I'm doing a study now on Africa, we actually have to go and collect the data on countries and pool that to present the data for Africa, right? So I think it's unfortunate, but that has been an ongoing practice for a very, very long time. Another question I saw that I think it was very, very interesting, I'd like to address, and you looking at the question with me, please jump in, Carolyn. One is, I believe, yes, it's about a formal and informal. It's quite interesting, and maybe it has been answered earlier, but I believe it's maybe from Frank, if I'm not mistaken. But the borders and the nation states, and the disconnect between the natural borders of the tribes and the nation state borders is one of the drivers of informal transaction, informal economy. Absolutely, and I think that makes so much sense. And I will give you an example from my own neighborhood in Libya. Libya and Tunisia, of course, there's a border, but the people in the south, especially from the Gabis area, are very similar to people in Western Libya. And you have a lot of, they call it money laundering, they call whatever you call it, whatever you want to call it. There was unofficial imports, exports, but because people are very similar. And I think that's probably one of the drivers of why is it that people feel they have the right to engage in these transactions, despite the national borders that are in there. Okay, you can jump in here. I hope the one last question about apartheid. Yes, apartheid has big one. I'm happy to answer that via email. I think some of my students had that question, but I think you see that in the agriculture sector and the land reforms in South Africa, which will have a big impact on the future of agriculture in that country. I hope they don't follow the same route of Zimbabwe. Obviously, I hope they do better than that. But that is a challenge, and that is an example of how apartheid legacy has an effect on business today.
Yeah, and I mean, similar to apartheid, right? One of the issues that is being debated now is the land redistribution. Because during apartheid, obviously, the indigenous population was sent to homelands and the land was taken away from them. Similarly, in Zimbabwe as well, with the colonizers, when they came, it was a similar strategy. But then we also what happened when they tried to implement land redistribution in Zimbabwe, it did not go well. So that's a big concern right now in South Africa is, are they going to follow the same route as Zimbabwe, which would be completely disastrous because South Africa is a big economy and quite a number of the surrounding countries rely on South Africa. So it's quite a big concern right now as to, how are you going to redistribute the land equally? And who deserves to get the land, right? Among the people that were disadvantaged, but how do you know who should get the land and how much of the land they should be given? So yeah.
Yes, and I hope there's a thoughtful approach to this as opposed to giving land to someone who does not have the cultural heritage or expertise. And there were food shortages obviously in Zimbabwe for a while. So it's all the right reasons, but it's all about the process, I think, in this case.
Yeah, it's all about the process. Yeah. There was a question, I think, somewhere about if slave trade has contributed to low levels of trust in Africa. So that's actually, there's actually a paper by Nathan Nunn and Leonard Wachikon where they actually discuss that one of the effects of the slave trade was that it lowered trust levels between tribes, such that today you can imagine if you're in parliament and you're trying to discuss policies, but you're from different ethnic tribes, there's no agreement. And this has delayed the progress of, policy making and developing economies. So I will add that reference to the slide decks that I will send through so that you can read some of that.
Very good, very good. The question about China, I'll leave this here, but there's a lot of critique of China's involvement in Africa. But I think if you look at the history of the Western MNEs in Africa, from Shell, the fiasco in Nigeria, Magros, French company, corruption in Tunisia, and British American Tobacco, I believe, in Ghana, I think it is very hard to think of Western MNEs taking the high ground or the moral ground. Their history does not support that. And I think China provides an alternative, provides additional bargaining power for African countries. And something people might not know is that the absolute majority of investment in Africa is actually private sector, Chinese private sector in manufacturing and other areas. The projects that are financed by the government tend to be high profile, and I have a couple of them I was going to share. And I think that's why you get so much media coverage, because they're massive projects. But I think a more balanced view of China's engagement, despite the debt issues and the other issues, of course, I think it is needed. I think we are right at 12 o'clock. I mean, we could have gone for another hour. Africa, we're all passionate about Africa, but I think in the interest of time, we'll stop here. I'll share the entire slide deck. If we were not able to answer your questions, I know that our friend Rebecca will save these and we'll answer them via email when we share the slide deck. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
I see our timekeeper, Leanne, is here, and she's reminding us that we need to stop. It's all yours, Leanne.
Thank you, Carolyn and Mourad, for sharing such informative and thought-provoking data and insights. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please remember to respond to our 5-question survey as you leave. This concludes the last webinar of 2021. We have prepared a rich list of programs and look forward to coming back in January. So on behalf of the GSU-CIBER team, we wish everyone a very safe, healthy, and happy holiday season. See you in 2022.